Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lempar, your regular host, and today we continue on a series of episodes about joining Special Operations Command, referred to as SOCOM, covering what it takes to become a member of the Special Forces and how to best prepare for the journey should you choose to take your career to the next level. This is the fourth episode of this series. If you haven't already listened to the other three, go back definitely because there's some absolute gold in there. Those three episodes will give you the context behind our discussion today. Previously, we've spoken to the Officer Commanding of Selection Wing about the process to join SOCOM. The physical training instructors have discussed how to physically prepare for selection. And Major Ange Uphill has shared insights and tips to prepare yourself physically for selection based on research findings from her PhD on previous selection courses. In this episode, I'm joined by two psychologists from SOCOM, Mel and Georgia, who have been involved in enhancing mindsets and building mental toughness, as well as the selection courses themselves, assessing how candidates respond to different scenarios and conducting exit interviews. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
By way of qualifying your opinion first up and position you within the selection process itself and SOCOM more broadly, where do you both fit in? I'll throw to Georgia first.
Yeah, I'm the Human Performance Optimization Psychologist at
awesome title as well. Yeah.
I know, it is very cool. At the ADF School of Special Operations. Essentially, the main part of my role is related to optimizing the mental performance for SOCOM members at ADF SSO. A big part of that is coaching, so I do that at an individual level, but also in group settings when I conduct workshops, which is very cool because I can often go out with the members that I coach, see the environment that they work in, their really specific job demands, which helps me a lot with providing more targeted mental skills specific to their role. Regarding selection, I provide materials for all members interested in adopting mental skills to their training. So that's largely in the form of the Mental Optimization Guide on Adele. And I also support the exit interviews on selection and recovery weeks on selection. So a big part that I'm doing at the moment is working with our direct recruit scheme members, and I run a lot of workshops on mental skills training for them to use on selection.
Get to get in there and get your hands dirty with training and stuff and coaching them.
Yeah, exactly. It's very unique for a psychologist.
Awesome. And Mel, different experience. Similar but different experience, but can you explain where you fit into the whole process?
Sure. In total, I've spent approximately 17 years with supporting in and working in the command. I think I've supported maybe 18 different selection courses over the years. I've also been part of a long-term research project where we've looked at what are the psychological factors that may derail someone on selection and what enables someone to complete selection and, more importantly, get selected for the reinforcement cycle. And like Georgia, we do a lot of support around not just the recovery week once they're sort of moving through into reinforcement cycle, but also just the support we give them during reinforcement and then subsequently into their career and life in the unit.
So 18 selections total and then a significant amount of research into the process itself. That's absolutely awesome. I wanted to shift to the mindset piece because we've been through a number of episodes thus far that talk to how physically demanding the Special Forces selection course can be. However, a common argument throughout the series, and I'm glad we have you last because I think it comes to a natural head, is that fitness is only one component. Mental preparation, the why, and the ability to push through some of the most gruelling challenges are what most argue gets you through. Can you describe how important a candidate's mental state is and the preparation they undertake has on their success on selection?
Certainly, the argument from our perspective is that we do know that what gets you to the end of selection, what gets you selected, is not just how physically fit you are. Yes, you absolutely have to be fit to get to the end. You need to have that stamina, the strength, all those things that Ange and Camper have talked through. It's a critical piece. You've got to be physically there at the end to be selected, right? But what we also know is that what really gets you to the end is your cognitive ability, so your ability to kind of problem solve, make sense of things, your working memory during the course of selection when you're tired and emotionally drained. But more importantly, the other two things are that mental toughness. And I don't just mean resilience and grit. I mean, and there's something more than that. There's something here about, which we could talk a little bit more in a minute, but there's something here about what it takes to get you to the end. And I don't just mean survive to the end. You don't want to just be a survivor at the end. You've got to be there at the end in a way that you're still engaging your brain. And you're, more importantly, the fourth thing is you're demonstrating those behavioural attributes, that you're doing it in a way that demonstrates you've got something to offer, even when you are tired, when you are depleted. when things are tricky or the task seems insurmountable, that you don't just fall over, that those things that we're looking for remain and in fact often come forward even more.
I want to zoom in on that mental toughness piece because you talked about the distinction between mental toughness and resilience. And I think we're going to talk about that further on in the episode. But can you just define the difference between those or talk through the difference between those two concepts now?
Oftentimes people talk about, and it's become a little bit sort of common for people to think about grit, this idea of perseverance and how much passion you have for your long-term goals. So perseverance and resilience kind of sit inside of grit. We would argue, and a lot of the international research shows, that mental toughness for Special Forces selection is one of the critical components of what gets you to the end. And it's usually one of a bigger predictor than the physical fitness stuff. It's really sort of made up of four core things. It's our capacity to endure and manage stress effectively. It's a resource that helps us guard against and counter things like stress. So there's something here about your control, which is all of these are kind of mindsets that you might have, but it's your sense of control, your inclination to feel that you still can be influential, that you can manage your anxiety. The second element is the commitment. Are you deeply involved in pursuing your objectives, regardless of the problems? So we'll talk, potentially about motivation, I'm sure, when we think about people trying to get themselves through selection, and that's a critical piece. Challenge is about our ability to perceive threats as a self-development opportunity. If in the middle of selection, if you're starting to unravel and you don't see this as, I want to see what my body can do. This is an opportunity. This is, from a mindset perspective, do you see it as a positive or as a negative? And the last one is confidence. And confidence is a critical thing in SOCOM. There's something here about our belief, our self-worth, our capacity to successfully navigate the settings we're in, the social interactions we're in. So those kind of four things. Mental toughness is a bigger thing than just am I resilient and can I kind of persevere? It's more than that.
That part about threats as opportunities, I think it'll come out later on, but we definitely need to zoom in on that. Before we do though, what's happening to you? How does the mind work in these sort of circumstances?
If we think of how our body is designed, it's designed to survive, right? It's designed to survive in challenging, difficult circumstances. And if we think of selection, it is an environment that's not particularly conducive to survival, right? So when our body is under that kind of physical, emotional, cognitive stress and pressure and fatigue, what our body wants to do is get us away from that stressor so that we can survive and be safe. So there's a number of ways that our brain will do this to us. It will start to bring up negative thoughts, negative self-talk. We'll start to think, why are we here? I can't do this. I'm at my limit. I can't possibly go any further. Our heart rate will go up. Our breathing and respiration rate will go up. We will maybe start to feel trembling hands or nausea. Potentially we'll want to physically feel like we want to run away from that stressor and just get out of that situation. So if we can rationalize when we're in that stress response that, okay, my body is feeling this stress, it's feeling this pressure, it is wanting to escape, that's when we need to start thinking about mental skills to go, how can I remind myself that I'm in control? I am in a safe place. I can push through this. I have the skills to persevere and to get through the end. That's where I think the mindset and mental skills really come in handy.
And for the skills component, what do you go into in the mental optimization guide? Like, what are the tangible skills?
We cover quite a lot, from motivation to combating negative self-talk to personal values. So it's quite broad so that individuals can go into the areas that they want to explore a bit more or use. But the key idea that we try to push is building this mental skills toolbox. So if you think of someone who is building a house, you wouldn't have just a hammer or just a wrench or whatever the tool might be, because depending on what part of the house you're building or what you're constructing will depend on what tool you need, right? So you want quite a lot of tools so that you can do a lot of things and build something quite complex. It goes the same for your mental skills. So you can learn breath work down to the real nitty-gritty and become a master at breath work, but it will not help you in all situations. So you want to learn as many different kind of mental skills as possible so that depending on the kind of stress you were under or the way you're responding in that situation, you can apply the best mental skill to that situation. We have a few key ones that come up most commonly, one of them being visualization, which we teach quite often because it's pretty easy to use and pretty easy to adapt depending on the environment. So one way you can use it is if you're struggling to push through something really physically demanding, or you're at that stage on selection where you're thinking, why am I doing this? There'd be so many other easier things for me to do, or things that wouldn't cause me so much pain and stress and all of those negative feelings. If you start to visualize yourself at the end, and whatever that end may be, end of the task, end of selection. An example is that a member used of calling their brother or family members at the end of selection and really imagining how you felt, how happy you are, the emotions that you're going through, being as specific as possible and using that visualization to help push you through some of those really tough times.
I imagine that it's absolutely awesome when you get to the end and they make that phone call, having visualized it for the whole duration. It's like, this is amazing. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really strong motivator to push through that pain and that tough time. And I think another way, because visualization is quite broad, another way that I've seen it commonly used is in some of those low tempo times. So I think people really prepare for being in a hyper arousal state or a really stressed state and how they might down-regulate, and then they find that when they're in a time where they've been given no direction and they have no idea what's happening next or what they're about to do, or perhaps they've been told to do a pack march and they don't know when that's going to end or what that end state looks like, and you can so easily get into your mind of thinking, I can't do this for another 30 minutes. What if they're going to ask me to do it for a couple of hours? And you can
It's day 3 and you're like, I'm going to do this for 21 days. Like, this is insane. Yeah.
Exactly. And if you dwell on that thought, it can be quite easy to go, I can't do this. I'm not going to do this. If you can distract your mind from that situation, and using visualization in this case can be helpful. And an example that I give is a member I worked with who is a mechanic in their civilian life, and there was a car that they were working on in their garage. So when he was doing really long pack marches or was in a low tempo time where he didn't know what was going to be happening next, so that he didn't get caught in that worry, thought, trap and cycle, he would start imagining himself working on the car that he had at home. So from walking into the garage to the tools that he would pick up to walking over to the car, and he would go into as much detail as possible. So how heavy was the tool in his hand? What did that part of the car feel like that he was holding on to or looking at? What was the smell like? Could he smell the petrol or the fumes? And he would run through fixing that car in his mind. Each time finishing fixing the car, he would go back and start again, and then the next time go into more detail, and the next time more detail. And you can see where I'm going with the thought of using a really strong and clear visualization to distract you and push you through so that you're not paying so much attention and getting caught up in the moment.
I suppose that's the down times, or the times where you're doing something consistently. How do you deal with the lack of, we talked about no positive affirmation and zero silent running. You talked about that before, Mel. But how do you deal with the zero feedback? It's not often that we ever do that in life. We always crave feedback from parents and then subsequently from our, chain of command and instructors throughout training. How do you deal with that component of zero feedback?
Well, it's a combination of all the things that to some extent we've already talked to. If you have that internal sort of locus of control, that sort of my reason why I'm doing this, my motivation is much more intrinsic, I'm much more likely to cope with the fact that I don't need external validation from other people. I don't need other people to give me a wink or a smile or a that was really good, right? And so one, it's to do with where does the sort of a sense of achievement for you as a human being come from? Is it from yourself or from others? Because if it's external, you're not going to cope very well in that environment. But if it is something that comes internally and it is something that you can draw on and you have other strategies to support you. So, for example, I do know what my big goal is. My goal is not just to get through selection. My goal is to be successful in the reinforcement cycle and to become an operator. So, yes, I can see that bigger goal, but you know what? That's a really long way in the future. And at the moment, I'm really, really struggling because my knee hurts and my back hurts, and I suspect this task is going to go on for 24 hours or, like there's so many things popping up in your head. I just need to focus on now. What can I control now? What's the next thing? This might go on for a while, but in the next 20 minutes, I can do this. And so I've had a few conversations with people where they've done things like taken a concept like the circle of influence and circle of control and gone, what's inside my control? What's outside of my control right now? And that stuff I can't control. I don't know when we're going to get food. I don't know when we're going to get to stop. I don't know what the next task is. But what I can control now is I can be awesome. I can actually demonstrate to them my teamwork and my persistence and my ability to manage the uncertainty. I can control that. And I can make sure that I'm paying attention to how I place my feet so that I'm not likely to put my ankles at risk. I'm making this up. But there's what are the things I can do as opposed to let me worry about all the things I can't do. I mean, one of the operators that's been one of our most successful overachievers, they're all overachievers, but one of those things that he often talks about is in his prep for this, it was very much about contingency planning. What if? Well, I know I'm not going to get control over my day, my life, my diet, those things I can't control, but what can I control? I can be much more clear and precise about my own little personal organisation, how I get myself ready in the morning, my preparation physically and mentally. Those are the things I can control. I can't control what's going to happen as I move over the start line. And so it's those things, how I'm practicing that compartmentalisation, how I'm practicing things like the contingency planning, my mindset. I'm here to see what I can do, not I'm here to see when I fail. And I think sometimes too when people have a plan B, if that plan B is really well formed, I think it sometimes unravels you. Like if you've got an option, I probably don't need to be here for 21 days. And at some point, often when people have really good options in the back pocket, that also kind of derails them. I'm not saying burn bridges and have nothing to go to.
Don't salt the earth at your unit before you leave.
Exactly. Yeah. Don't do that. Don't give up your house and sell your belongings or pack things into storage. I think there's something here about realistic preparation, absolutely. But there's something here about being really, really clear what I'm doing and why, and making sure that you're setting yourself up for success through that.
I'll throw back to Georgia. The reality of the experience may hit some harder than others. Obviously, preparation is key, but it's hard to predict how you might react until you're actually in it. Are there some key themes or reasons why members elect to withdraw at own request? And can they be mitigated prior to the selection?
Yeah, definitely. Based on research that we've done from the exit interviews that we conduct
because you get to speak to people when they come off, right?
Yeah, everyone that comes off, whether that's from withdrawing at their own request or whether they are pulled off at any stage of selection, they conduct an exit interview with a psychologist. And we've gotten a lot of research from what people discuss as their reasons for why they voluntarily withdraw or take themselves off course. The most common reasons for that being firstly pre-existing injuries or niggles. That's quite common, particularly because a lot of people may think that if they have a little pain or soreness that it won't come up on selection, but they usually are significantly exacerbated in those first few days. So that's a really common one, particularly at the front end of selection that people voluntarily withdraw off. The second is for family or psychosocial reasons. So that includes feelings of guilt for being away from family, maybe missing key milestones. So something that we see a lot are particularly members with young families, and they start to feel that guilt that they're away from that they're not there to support. So that's a big reason as well, because the reality of being away from your family can only hit while you're on selection. And the final one is really lack of mental preparation. So the physical, emotional and cognitive demands that you will be under on selection will be significant. So if you're lacking the appropriate skills to handle that kind of stress and that kind of situation, it's all too easy to pull out that voluntary withdrawal card. Regarding ways of how you can sort of mitigate some of those things, to firstly sufficiently prepare. That's kind of the key thing that you can do in the lead up to going on selection. So ensure that you have looked after your body in the lead up, that you've discussed your commitment to Special Forces with your family, and that you can come up with a plan to support them, not just while you're away on selection, but during your career in SOCOM. so that it doesn't come up as a worry or a guilt while you're away, so that you don't give yourself a reason to voluntarily withdraw off selection. And finally, to think about stressful and high-pressure situations in the past that you've been in, particularly looking at incidences where you may have failed or come close to that point. These ones are really key because if you can reflect on how you responded in that situation, then you can apply the relevant mental skills to support you in that environment so that that doesn't reoccur or come up again.
Just to add, one of the things that does derail people and be a core driver of withdrawal at own request is that self-doubt. And sometimes self-doubt comes through because we're comparing ourselves to other candidates on course. So if you've shown up to course and you see a bunch of people you've never met before who seem amazing in humans, but they're also really fit and they seem well prepared, what we sometimes hear is people will start to compare themselves to those individuals. So if I start to see those people pull off and you go, oh, that guy was fitter than me, or that person was more prepared than me, he got more checkpoints on the NAVEX. What we do tend to see is people start to get in their own heads and it becomes a little bit like they circle their own plug hole and they start to sort of undermine themselves with that comparison to others. Particularly too, if you've come to selection with a bunch of people from your own unit, because then you know those people even more. And so your comparison becomes, but he's such a cool dude and he really wanted it. And, you know, when we've been in training, he's been pushing himself so hard. And so there's something here about try really hard to get out of that mode. You've got to be there to sort of run your own game, be in it for your own reasons, and be focused on your own performance. That comparison to others can be a real hiding to nowhere.
And I think that's an awesome point and an awesome segue, because the next question is about like getting tips from those in the battalions or units. It's like when we're trying to throw the sensors out there and find more out about selection itself, most people get their tips in the battalions or units from those that have just returned. It's an incredibly vulnerable situation to have been. If you've just been unsuccessful in selection, then return to your own unit almost immediately, I imagine, after your exit interview. How should we go about finding out more information from those people, but not putting them in a situation where they feel as though they have to explain their failures and, you know, trying to put them in an incredibly vulnerable situation?
I suppose the first thing you can do is place yourself in their shoes. So if you were coming off selection, what are some questions you probably wouldn't want to be asked, and what are some you wouldn't mind discussing? Another one could be thinking of what you'd find actually helpful to ask from that person. So naturally, you're pretty curious about what goes on in selection and how your friends may have responded, what might have come up for them. But really ask yourself, what would I want to get out of that? So a good question could be asking your friend what they might have done differently, how they might have prepared differently or better for the experience could be more useful than just trying to get out maybe where they went wrong or what went wrong on course.
Because a lot stays, I suppose, in the implicit, like the indirect questions leave the vulnerable parts implicit, and it might make them feel comfortable, I suppose. Yeah. Mel, have you got anything else on that?
I think at the end of the day, there's no profile of a successful operator. We don't actually have a profile that says we're looking for someone who's got a little bit of this and lots of that and very little of that. Because if we're actually selecting everybody the same way, we're actually cloning our organisation. We're essentially creating or pulling together a group of people who will think the same way or behave the same way. And at the end of the day, someone is redundant, right? We need diversity of thought. We need diversity of behaviour. We need the ability to, you know, have people who are adaptive and can deliver in different contexts at different times through uncertainty, through volatility. And so there's something here about, you know, definitely ask, again, curious questions that help your friend reflect, but at the same time maybe give you a sense of what are some top tips from this person. But at the end of the day, it's about you then thinking about, okay, so what does that mean for me? Given what I think my motivation is, given what I think my long-term career might be, you need to kind of put it in that context. There's something here about you then thinking through, okay, well, if this person wanted to do it or would think next time around they're going to do a bit more of this, is that something that's a gap for me? At the end of the day, it's not just about being voyeuristic about someone else's experience. There's something here about what are the takeaways for you.
I suppose that touches on the mental toughness and explores some of the reasons why members opt to withdraw. And then we talked a little bit about explaining failures. Let's talk more about what success looks like to give it a more optimistic spin and the parts that get there. So candidates are armed with strategies to deal with different situations. Throughout the recruitment process, there are a few touch points that candidates have with psychologists or you two directly. Are you able to share what the psychological considerations are for identifying whether someone is suitable?
Yeah, we can give you the exact profile. No, I'm just
Yeah,
kidding. So we can't give or go into the exact details of what we're looking for. Essentially, we're trying to identify, one, whether you're aware and cognizant of the requirements of the job itself, whether you're sufficiently motivated and also prepared, not just for selection, but the career of being in SOCOM. There are a number of cognitive factors that come into play on selection that can influence not only your experience on selection and how you find it, but also whether you complete it with success and get picked up at the end. Some of those can include whether you are sufficiently motivated to be there. So we often hear of members coming in with quite romanticized expectations of the role, like they think it's really cool, the work they're going to do, or they'll just be with their friends doing interesting stuff that they couldn't do in other units. But those reasons usually aren't sufficient to motivate you through those really tough times on selections. Adaptive coping strategies is another one. So if you don't have the ability to regulate your emotions, to manage your stress response, to overcome the self-doubt that will inevitably come up while you're on selection, you will struggle to push through. And a final one for me is having self-awareness. So being able to be aware of how you perform under stress and fatigued with very little support, if any, so that you can set up strategies to optimize your performance and so you know what you might need to work on or how you might need to be best prepared going into that situation.
So you mentioned motivation, and it links back to one of your previous points as well about talking about the why. Can you provide some additional insights about that and the strategies to uncover the why and really drill down on what, like, so it's clear the long term, why do I want to be part of SOCOM? Yeah,
definitely. We promote cultivating an intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation stems from an internal or personal desire to do something, rather than having an extrinsic motivation, which arises from rewards or punishments. And the reason that we kind of push intrinsic motivators is really because they'll persist longer in the face of challenges. There are a few strategies to do this. However, it's really important to state first that you need to be honest and realistic about your expectations of the role. So while selection is seen as this big goal to achieve, and honestly, most of the discussion regarding Special Forces focuses on selection, it's just one of the hurdles you will need to jump and overcome in order to join SOCOM. So there really needs to be a strong purpose and goal that's anchoring you so that you're able to extend beyond selection. So you're able to complete Rio and be effective in your role. So we really want candidates to be motivated for the role itself and not just motivated to complete selection, because that will only get you so far. There are a number of ways that you can do this, but considering why you're applying for Special Forces and whether you think your motivation to join is extrinsic or intrinsic or maybe both, consider the most challenging point in your career and ask yourself what has kept you going. That can be something you can draw on while you're on selection. And we recommend trying to think of something you've used in the past, because that's evidence to yourself, right, that you have a motivator or a purpose that can pull you through those really tough times.
What about like for people that haven't had those challenges? Like if you talked about a scenario where someone's, I wouldn't say crushed everything they've ever done, but they're naturally quite fit and they've always worked hard and they have a good work ethic and they can't draw from those experiences of like significant failure in the past. How do they go about like building that skill to get the purpose or the why?
Yeah, I think one thing can be looking at your personal values and goal for life. Seeing if that aligns with a SOCOM career can be one way. Mel, did you have one?
One of the other things I'd suggest is during your preparation phase is actually put yourself out there and do things that you wouldn't normally do. So, for example, go and do something incredibly difficult like learn another language, particularly if you've been someone who's always, as you said, crushed it in your life. If you've not had a lot of adversity, if you've not built those sort of that natural sort of mental toughness muscle as much as, say, somebody who's done a little bit tougher, go and do something that is tough, that you will fail at, that you will have days where you sit there going, man, I'm really bad at this, and I sound terrible.
But what does it feel like when I'm really bad?
Exactly. Yeah. But so therefore, what am I going to do about that? How do I keep going? What's my strategy from here? And start to kind of challenge yourself. And those are things that we can use in SOCOM down the track too, like doing things like learning a new language or picking up something that's an unusual skill set. Because at the end of the day, that challenge you give yourself, it's less about the thing you do and more about the behavioural skills you pick up, the practice of the 13 attributes that you get, so your adaptability, your emotional regulation, the perseverance, those attributes you're practicing whilst you do that gives you the opportunity to do that. So I think it's one of those ways that you can prep yourself, particularly if you've not necessarily felt you had a lot of kind of practice at that before.
Yeah. And to go back to the why component rather than just not being exposed to failures, but you had an anecdote pre-episode that you spoke through about a diary, and that purpose waning throughout selection. Can you just go through that story for us, Mel?
Yeah, one of the things that I suppose you could encapsulate what Georgia was saying earlier in terms of people's reasons for pulling off course is it often boils down to, at the end of the day, there's been a lot of self-doubt. And it's self-doubt because maybe they did lose track of that motivation and the why they were doing it, or they'd not really thought through their partner calling them up 3 days before that she was pregnant, or they haven't really thought through those things, and then all these doubts start to creep in. Our biggest risk, I would argue, is that self-doubt that creeps in. And we, a number of years ago, saw this in real time. We managed to find someone's diary in the bin after selection. This person had pulled off on day 16. And yes, candidates are told not to keep diaries then, but this individual hadn't kept a log of what was going on selection. What this person had done is actually almost journaled their psychological experience of selection. And it was incredibly useful for us as psychologists because we were flicking through it going, oh my goodness, look at this. And you can see, day one, this person was really excited to be here. This is exciting. I've been training for this. So, this is something I really want. By day 2, day 3, oh wow, this is really tough. By the time they got to day 5 or 6, they started to journal about the ache, the pain, the thing that they'd found most difficult. You could see them starting to wonder about their performance. So they're starting to get in their own head, doing the DS's job for them, essentially, by starting to kind of unravel themselves. They don't really know how well they're going, but they think they're not going as well because they've also probably never done something like this with a bunch of other highly motivated, capable individuals. So now they're comparing themselves maybe to others. And you could start to see this person unravel. And by day 11 or 12, they were talking about their partner and their dog and maybe sitting on the couch and having a pizza. And then suddenly, by day 16, they'd withdraw it on request. So you could almost see this person kind of unravel in real time. And it's that self-doubt and that kind of unraveling. And it's kind of retrofitting that back to your question. So what are those skills that you need? There's something here about, have I been practicing the how do I pull myself back? The thought stoppage. I catch myself doing that. What does that look like? Or I'm in a situation that I have no control over. I'm doing a task that feels like it's impossible or thankless potentially. What am I going to do? What am I going to say to myself? Do I have a visualization or do I have a mantra that keeps me going? It's those things that make a difference. And I think going back to your point about how to prep, one of the things you can do is to actually, try and do a little bit of that before you get to selection. One of the things you often hear people say on during their exit interview is they didn't really realise what it would feel like, that cumulative fatigue. And I don't just mean the physical fatigue of what you do over the 5, 6, 7, 12 days. It's also the mental fatigue and the emotional fatigue of it. And that's because often when people are training for selection, they're doing a session in the morning, a session in the afternoon. I've got my 3.2 practice on Saturday with my best mate and I'm going to do a NAV exercise next weekend and I've got a 20 clicker. They do them in these compartmented situations as opposed to back to back to back to back to back. And one of the things I often say to people is maybe have it, and maybe the PTIs and Ange as the physio would hate me for doing this, but I say to people, look, 3 months out, I recommend you give yourself more than 2 days, but maybe a 3 days, maybe a 4 days, where you do a bunch of stuff back to back. You even give yourself maybe only 4 hours sleep one night. You do a bunch of those things and you almost get a little bit of a taster of what that accumulation and that degradation feels like over time. So you can practice in real time those strategies that you need and you are going to need and to have in place. You give yourself enough time to recover, obviously afterwards. But I actually think that if you've never done that before, that's a really important thing for you to do.
Shouldn't be the first time on selection itself.
Exactly. And I also think that, some people will say to me, oh, yeah, but I've always run triathlons. Yeah, you've run triathlons and I know you've been a unit and you've been amazing at that. But you're talking about something that I'm not being flippant, but might have only lasted 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah, not 21 days. Yeah.
That's right. We're needing you to be able to back that up day after day after day. And I want you to get a sense of what that feels like. Because when you show up to selection, finding it out on your day 3 or 4 or 5 will be a bit of shock of capture. This is kind of, oh my goodness, I thought I knew what I was getting into. Look, you know, you don't, but you kind of do, but you don't. Until you're really in it, then you go, that's what that feels like. My friend talked about fatigue, but that's what fatigue feels like for me in this situation at this time, given my prep. So it's getting that sense.
And George, I suppose you've got a personal anecdote about the Special Forces Assessment Program, like directly, I suppose it's more at the tactical level, but like seeing people do that or make that mistake on the SFAP?
Yeah, it comes up fairly often in our SFAP exit interviews, that when we're kind of discussing people's physical and mental preparation in the lead up to doing their entrance test, particularly if they haven't done well on their 3.2, and that is usually where we see people fail or come off on the SFET. A lot of them will say that they didn't practice the exercises in succession or in the order that they would usually be doing it in during SFET. And I suppose the point that we usually bring them back to is, are you practicing under test conditions? How do you expect yourself to complete it in the time if you haven't actually practiced doing it that way? How do you know how you respond? How do you know if you can still do the time in the run after you've done those other exercises and you're fatigued? And it's very similar, although on a smaller scale, to selection. Are you practicing and aware of how you respond in that environment so you can be best prepared for it?
And it's easy to go to the physical stuff, right? So the test, you should test your physical ability under test conditions. However, like for the mental stuff, same, I imagine it's exactly the same, yeah?
Yeah, definitely. I always recommend, because I hear quite a lot of people who have only ever practiced the components, 1 in isolation, but 2 on their own. So when they get there on the night and there's 30 plus other individuals around them who may look fitter than they are, who may seem intimidating, and that can throw out their game plan that they have for the evening. And that's largely because they haven't practiced with anyone else. And so they're not actually used to being in that competing mindset while they're there, and that can really throw people. We can see a lot of performance anxiety. We can see them not following their plans or them freezing up. So really ensuring that you're prepared and practicing under that environment is really helpful.
And I suppose that goes to, so we know BFA results, EOI, physical 30-week training program, absolutely awesome, and we're smashing the physical stuff. But come back, like how early should we start the mental stuff in terms of visualization, which you talked about before, or compartmentalizing things, different techniques? How far out, noting you talked, Georgia, about coaching, right? Having coaching in that. How far out are we starting that sort of process?
As early as possible, really. So we've designed the mental optimization guide on Adele to be a 30-week program as well. The reason we did that is because it aligns really well with the physical training program, and we want you to practice the mental skills alongside the physical training skills so that with practice it starts to become subconscious, so that you're naturally doing those things under stress, under fatigue, rather than having to consciously think of mental skills that you need to practice. So I always say that's a really great foundation place to start, just to learn about the different mental skills, because for a lot of people it's not things that they would have thought of before or that they would have needed to consider. So going through the guide and becoming aware of what strategies are out there is really a good place to start.
And I imagine, Mel, you're just about to say you can never start too early, but sorry, your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we do in the exit interviews is we actually have a question on our exit questionnaire: how mentally prepared do you think you were? And it's just over 60% of people think they were mentally prepared. And then when you talk to them in the interview and you go, really? Do you really think you were? I mean, we say that in a different way, but when you kind of prod and poke and try and get them to have some realization about what's just happened for them, they do acknowledge that maybe they haven't. And, you know, there's a combination of reasons why sometimes people haven't. I think for some people they don't see it as important. I'm not saying they've necessarily paid it off, but they've certainly left it to the last minute potentially. Or they've seen it as being, well, I read some really interesting books and, you know, about people who've done it. And so, you know, they think that by osmosis it's just going to kind of pop inside their brain. So there's something here about, you know, if you want it to be an unconscious skill set that you have that you're just drawing on naturally all the time, You've got to be practicing that from the beginning if you haven't been practicing it since you were 5 years old. These skills are things that you need to have throughout. So get onto it quickly. Doing it 4 weeks before isn't going to get you to the point of fluency. And so there's something here about you making sure that you start really, really early and you knowing that it makes a difference. If I can leave anybody with anything out of this is to say to you, look, selection is not a physical course. It's a mental, emotional, behavioural and physical thing. The research bears that out. The best predictors of who gets to the end and who gets selected is often not the physical stuff. It is that other stuff. International evidence bears it out. Our evidence bears it out. When we look at who withdraws at own request, the two biggest predictors are how mentally tough you are and, more importantly, how much you get in your own head. We refer to them as self-handicapping behaviours. How much people get in their own head and start to engage in behavioural strategies or sort of thinking strategies that undermine themselves during the course of selection. You need strategies to manage that.
I suppose if we do zoom back out and like to those things that are not physical, which are sort of, I suppose, the selection attributes or the SOCOM attributes. OC selection we went through, and I'll just recap because, it was some time ago, but the SOCOM, the 13 common SOCOM attributes during selection: leadership, trainability, teamwork, self-discipline, perseverance, initiative, adaptability, integrity, communication, emotional regulation, humility, independence and judgment. I suppose, Mel, how do candidates enhance these attributes? And I suppose they're all equivalent. Like there's no one more important than the other. But can you draw a couple out just to give us some real insight into how to develop those skills when you with the argument that it's not just physical?
I think it comes back to some of the things that we were talking about. If you picked adaptability, for example. Adaptability is sort of how open you are to new experiences, how open you are to new ways of thinking versus how traditional you are or conservative you are. So there's something here about expand your brain.
You talked about threats as opportunities before. I'm paraphrasing what you said, but yeah, exactly. Like leaning into those things that are going to grow you.
And making sure that you're thinking about things in new ways. So don't just go to Channel 9 for your news or Sky News for your news. Go and listen to other voices, get other perspectives. Put yourself in situations where, as we talked about earlier, things are uncertain or things are tricky and difficult. And as an operator, you're going to be in what we call a VUCA environment. It's volatile. It's going to be complex. It's going to be ambiguous at times, and you need to have practice at doing that. And so, as I said earlier, learning a new language or going and I had someone recently who had gone and taken deliberately, by the way, some dancing classes. And it was purely because he wanted to put himself into a really uncomfortable environment.
In public,
In public. But it was also because it actually had some other things in it. He was learning things like, or practicing things like kinesthesis, so the proprioception, so feeling where your body is in space. So you don't need to know my arm's there. I can feel that it's there. That he was getting an opportunity to develop things like his balance. And so, he put himself into a different situation. He got to go and talk to other human beings, civilians, for example, who had different ways of thinking, and he's making and that opens your mind about stuff and gets you thinking about things from different perspectives. So, there's a couple of suggestions around adaptability. We talked earlier about perseverance, and I would argue there's a little bit more to that. But it is about trying things that are tricky and making yourself keep going, And it could be the learning a new language, or it could be picking up, salsa dancing. I don't care what that looks like, but it's doing those things and not just sticking with the stuff that is in the military echo chamber that you and your friends do. Go and do other stuff.
And I think the common so it's talking about getting different experiences to become more adaptable, and then perseverance, obviously, as a obvious one, but more important than what it looks at face value. I think a common thread throughout all of the episodes is this reattempting selection, and I think Campo was talking about them, the candidates coming in and being sorted, knowing where their stuff is. They look confident, they're reattempting, and Major Uphill talked about the success once you reattempt. I suppose. Do people that come back for a second or third attempt at selection make it through? Are they more likely to make it through? And if so, why? From a mental perspective, I suppose.
I would argue they're more likely to get through if they've come back with the right mindset. And that starts with what Georgia was saying earlier. You've got to know your reason why you're back. If you're just coming back because it's that mountain you didn't climb, I've got to get back to selection. The goal's not I want to become a qualified operator and do good for SOCOM. If it's become, I've just got to get back to selection, that's not going to get you through. I see lots of people in exit interviews who it's their second or third attempt and they were like, yeah, I just realised I didn't want it anymore. Like I couldn't figure out why I was here because they just got onto this train of back-to-back sort of attempts and forgot why they were trying to do it. But if people come back really, really sharp about the why, they've been really, really clever about their preparation, they took their learnings from attempt number one and maybe even the feedback they were given, and they've done something meaningful with that. They've tried to fix some of the gaps, address some of the attribute things that they didn't demonstrate the first time round, get themselves some additional practice, get themselves some feedback. When they've done those things, I would say to you that those people are incredibly successful. I mean, we've got a SOCOM that's full of people who, yes, did it on the first attempt, but also some of them did it on their second or their third attempt. You can be successful. Absolutely, I'd encourage you to try and get through the first time round and set yourself up for success by doing all the things we've talked about today.
And throw yourself completely into that first attempt, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid of that second attempt, but come back when you're ready. There is a physical and a mental and emotional drain of training for a year or two to get there. And if you want to do a back-to-back attempt, be really, really sure about putting yourself through that again. I would rather you took a year off, got some life experience, did some travel, did some growing and developing.
Dancing,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Don't forget that there's some significant physical reasons for doing that. But essentially, then come back absolutely refreshed and really clear on that reason why you're doing it. Yes, your life might be a bit more complicated at the second attempt. Maybe you found someone that you're now in a relationship with. You've got a puppy. I don't know. I'm not trying to be flippant, but your life might be different, but absolutely coming back more mature, more emotionally stable, good to go, clear about what you want to do. You've gone and got some decent coaching from some people to kind of support you with that mental prep. You didn't pay it off. Love to see you back again. There's some amazing people who come through selection who we want to see back. There's some amazing people I've seen in exit interviews over the years where you've gone, I'd love to see you back. And I've said that to them. I'd love to see you come back and give it another shot.
Yeah, so re-attempting, but trying to give it your all on the first one. If we come back to some more practical, more pragmatic approach for the 5 key tips or takeaways, have you got 5? It doesn't need to be 5; it can be any number. But have you got roughly 5 that key takeaways or bits of information that you want to get through to every person that's going to undertake selection in the next couple of weeks, or those who are considering it down the track, in a year's time or more?
I think the first one would be to consider whether this job is really for you. I think be realistic and really honest to yourself about the requirements of the role, the implications it will have on your life, and be honest about whether you see this as being a long-term career. Because when we keep drawing back to the motivation, the purpose, those are things that will anchor you and push you through the tough times. And at the end of the day, we want to select people that see this as a long-term career, not as a really cool experience or something to prove to themselves that they can get through. So that, I think, would definitely be the first key tip. I would also say, and I think this comes from my coaching background, is to really reflect on your limitations under stress and fatigue. I can throw at you all the mental skills in the world that, elite athletes or performers or people use to enhance their skill set and optimize their abilities. But at the end of the day, if you don't know your limitations, they may not be useful at all. You may just be trying a bunch of skills that don't actually enhance your abilities because they're not targeting your limitations, or they're not targeting things specific to what you need to do or specific for your role. So I think self-awareness and reflection is really key.
And then Mel?
For me, there's probably a couple of things that I've got to say again. So one of them is self-doubt is going to be your biggest derailer. So there is something here about you making sure that you grip up those cognitive skills that are going to help you manage that, stop that, engage in more helpful patterns of thinking. Because at the end of the day, my tip 2 would be it's your mindsets that are going to get you through. there is something here about you. You know, when I went back to my definition of mental toughness earlier, there is something here about if you see these things as a self-development opportunity. You know, one of the operators I've spent a bit of time with has always said, for him, it was always a curiosity over how much I could push myself. I absolutely was motivated by the role and I absolutely wanted to do that thing. But at the end of the day, this was a sense of curiosity for me. How far could I go? And his life is full of those experiences. And so there's something here about being optimistic, being sort of having that sort of learning opportunity mindset, being open to those new experiences, being comfortable with discomfort, you know, having a really sort of clear understanding as to how to manage your stress and anxiety when it pops up. Those things are all really important. And so, you know, it's that self-doubt, it's coming in with the right kind of mindset. And at the end of the day, you know, set yourself up for success. You know, don't take yourself off. Don't do the DS's job for them. If you are starting, because it's a silent running, there's no feedback.
Yeah, no positive affirmation as well.
If you start to get inside your own head and you start to unravel because you think maybe you're comparing yourself to other people on the course, you know, I'm shorter, I'm not as fit, I'm whatever, that will start. That's not helpful. They can only select you if you're there at the end. Don't make it easy for them, right?
Once you cross that start
Absolutely
line, I suppose, the decision is outside of your hands. Let them make the decision, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, definitely let them make the decision. You just give your best. They can't select you if you're not there and if you haven't given your best. We want you to give your best. At the end of the day, we want you to have had the best experience you possibly have. You've had every opportunity, which is why we don't talk about selection. We want everybody to have the same level playing field. We all have the same sort of ability to come to selection in at the same place. So there's something here about come in here and give your best shot. And at the end of the day, then the desk will be able to select out of the batch of people that are there at the end. So make sure you're there at the end.
They can't do anything with you if you're not there at the end. And that it links back to your point before about people coming off and you're doing exit interviews and you'll be like, oh, I want you to come back because, like, you know, they might not know it at the time, but everyone wanted them to get to the end so they can make a decision on selection. If you're not there, you can't be selected.
There are so many different things that this command does. There are so many different types of individuals that can be successful. And so, you know, you don't have to be the size of a fridge and, you know, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
You know, we're looking for smart people who are agile, who can do things that we need them to do in a quiet way or in a quiet professional way. And so we need lots of different types of people because there's lots of different types of jobs. And I'm sure there's lots of different types of jobs. And so we want as many good quality people in this command because we do important work and, you know, we also want to work with good people, you know.
That's absolutely awesome. I think that's an awesome place to leave it with the more pragmatic, practical tips for selection. Those 5, it was way more than 5 key takeaways, but you got some awesome gold in there. Thank you both so much for your time on the mental component of selection.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.